Hey guys, what's going on? It's Broken Nose Gaming here, and today I have another World of Tanks Blitz video for you. Now, as of this recording, we have a special game mode going on currently. It is called Mad Games. If you have not heard of or played Mad Games, basically, each tank in the game will have its own special set of unique abilities that you can use while in battle. You do not have respawns though, so once you are knocked out, that is the end of it for you. You can go to the garage and play another match. So Mad Games is fun because it gives tanks sort of out of the ordinary abilities that you definitely wouldn't see anywhere else. It is a little cartoony because of that, a little arcadey for sure. But overall, Mad Games is fun. I also like the fact that Mad Games isn't so drawn out compared to some other game modes. Big Boss, while fun, can be very long, and the other game modes that can be very long is Uprising. Uprising is another very long game mode. So you can play quite a few matches in Mad Games because of the single life, aspect of it compared to the other game modes. But what do I mean by abilities? So let's go ahead. We will pop open our little bar here and let's just jump into tier 5. We could take a look at the Panzer IV. The Panzer IV, as you can see here, there's this little box that says abilities. If we click on that, there are 2 pre-installed abilities. Every tank gets 2 abilities. Some of them are the same as other tanks because there's, only so many abilities you can give so many tanks. But this particular Panzer IV has 2 abilities. One of them is called the Accelerator, which, depending on if you're moving forwards or backwards, no matter what the speed you're moving at, you will instantly move 50 meters in that direction. The only time this doesn't work is if your track is broken. You cannot use the accelerator move. It can be useful for last-ditch effort ramming, but I don't recommend it because depending on what you run into, you may end up losing as well. The other ability that it comes pre-installed with is the Saboteur system. The Saboteur system is a passive ability that essentially modifies the Sixth Sense skill or aspect. Sixth Sense usually pops at 3 seconds of being spotted. With Saboteur system, it will immediately notify you when you were spotted. Once you're out of range, you will also immediately disappear. Normally you have to wait 10 seconds, your camo resets, and you are out of range. So the Saboteur system is very useful for mobile tanks that can abuse the view range and stay out of range until need be, and then pop into another area. And with the instant light bulb from the Sixth Sense, it's fairly easy to tell when you're spotted. Now, as you can see, that one's a passive ability. The Accelerator is a ability that you have to activate, and that's how it works. You get one that you activate, and then you get an ability that is passive and is on at all times, essentially. So if we look at some other tier 5 tanks, the T1 Heavy, for example, has its own special set of abilities here. The T14 Heavy has its own set of special abilities here. And you can see some tanks like the M4 Sherman have the same exact set of abilities as the Panzer IV. So I'm going to talk about my favorite set of abilities that tanks have in Mad Games, and I will show that to you right now. I have 15 tanks to show you, and they are both collector / premium, and there are some researchable tech tree tanks as well. But the abilities that I like to use when I play Mad Games, the activatable one is called Chameleon Concealment. That will turn your tank invisible for 10 seconds, and you can go much faster. I believe you can go twice the top speed, and you get 5 times the engine power, so you can accelerate much quicker. The passive ability is called Rammer Rig. Rammer Rig is exactly what it sounds like. It will increase the damage that you output to enemies from ramming by 65%, and you also take a 70% reduction from getting rammed, so the damage to come back on you is greatly reduced. There are some things to do that can make this even more advantageous. If you go and you equip your tanks with equipment, in the Vitality department, there is the first one here. Normally it's defense system that everyone uses because it helps all kind of the modules and stuff like that. But if you flip over to improved modules, you can also reduce damage from ramming by another 40%. So at this point, you have a much bigger damage reduction and much greater damage output when it comes to the ramming ability when you use Rammer Rig and the improved modules. So like I said, there are 15 tanks. I will go through them. They start at tier 6. They skip tier 9, unfortunately, and they end at tier 10. Now, when it comes to the Rammer Rig and concealment abilities, not every tank is created equal. Some are better than others, and I will talk about what makes them better or worse than others. There's really two things, and that is the weight of the tank and the power to weight ratio of the tank. Now, when it comes to these stats, we are going to be talking about stock stats. I won't be including any provision modifications or anything like that. But I will not be going into detail in talking about effective power to weight ratio, which is when you have basically the ground modifiers, depending on if it's hard, medium, or soft terrain. I do have a list that I will put up for all 15 tanks at the end of the video, just in case you want to see like just how good they are effectively when it comes to the horsepower per ton, the power to weight ratio. But I'm just going to be going over the standard weight and power to weight ratio for each tank. I will say though that most of the time power to weight ratio and effective power to weight ratio are pretty similar to each other. There are some outliers, but overall they're pretty close. So starting off at tier 6, we have the VIII Firefly. It is a premium tank. As a matter of fact, for tier 6, all the tanks will be either premium or collector. I'll give a little brief info on the tank, and then I'll talk about its weight and power to weight ratio and how effective it should be at doing damage. Now, the VIII Firefly is kind of an interesting tank. It was made for the 5-year anniversary of Blitz. It has a Sherman Firefly turret with a Cromwell hull, which I believe for the most part is the same for all of the VIIIs. They have a Cromwell hull with their particular turret that it's mated to, giving it the name. So the VIII Firefly is okay. It's pretty middle of the road. It has a weight of 26.87 tons and a power to weight ratio of 19.35 horsepower per ton, which means it can get around the map fairly well and you can inflict some decent damage to it. That's not to say that there are better tanks out there, but the VIII Firefly is okay. Next up is the Turbo. Now the Turbo was a Battle Pass tank. I believe it is based on a Swedish STRV tank of the same tier, tier 6. It's themed to look like, I think, a go-kart. Yeah, it's got like rubber tires. The Turbo, even though having the name Turbo, is not that great of a tank. Personally, I wouldn't use this one. It's got a disappointing weight of 25.71 tons, and its horsepower to weight ratio, or power to weight ratio, is pretty poor at 17.51 horsepower per ton. It's not very fast, it's not very heavy, it's okay. And since it was a Battle Pass tank, it's not really available, if at all ever. It was only available the one time for the Battle Pass. I don't really use this tank, to be honest. It's so mediocre that I really haven't enjoyed using it, and I will only use it in Mad Games if it's like birthday mode or something like that. I would, if you have this tank, I can tell you there are much better tanks to use for ramming in Mad Games than this. And now we'll move on to our next tank, which is another Battle Pass tank. This is the Explorer. Now, as you can see, the Explorer is essentially just a space reskin of a Cromwell, but it is also probably the second best when it comes to ramming in tier 6. That being said, it's got a hefty weight, best in class, of 29.37 tons, and it has a power to weight ratio of 22.13 horsepower per ton, which is very respectable for both. Does a very good job of ramming and getting around the map. But I will say that the best in class, in my opinion, would probably be the Cromwell B, which is the next tank and last tank that we'll talk about in tier 6. Cromwell B obviously is just a premium Cromwell, has a slightly inferior gun, and it is slightly lighter than the Explorer at 27.74 tons, but has a slightly better power to weight ratio at 23.44 horsepower per ton. So it can get around much, well, not much quicker, but it can get around quicker than the Explorer, and it still has about the same ramming potential as the Explorer does. The other positive and reason why I would consider the Cromwell B the best in class at Tier 6 is the Cromwell B is fairly available. It does pop up in the premium shop from time to time, so you shouldn't have a hard time getting this tank versus the other three where they're either not available because they were Battle Pass tanks, or in the matter of the Wi-Fi Firefly, it was an anniversary tank that pops up in the anniversary shop sometimes, or in the 10th anniversary was given out as a reward for completing a fairly long quest. It was one of the tanks that you could get in the process of the quest. So, of the four, I would probably recommend the Cromwell B when it comes to picking a Tier 6 rammer for Mad Games. Now we can move on to Tier 7. Tier 7 has one researchable tech tree tank in it. We will start, though, at the Magnate, which was not a Battle Pass tank, but it was a season reward tank from Season 1, which was the first time Wargaming did this. The Magnate should look similar. It definitely shares some similar qualities to another tank in the tech tree, the Indian Panzer, which may or may not show up in a later point in this video. But the Indian Panzer has very similar stats as the Magnate here. It's just the Magnate is down tiered a little bit. It's a little less powerful than the Indian Panzer. When it comes to ramming or being used in Mad Games here, it has a much more respectable weight of 38.78 tons, but its power to weight ratio is a little slouchy at 17.53 horsepower per ton. So while you do step up almost 10 tons compared to the Tier 6 mediums, your power to weight ratio is pretty similar to the Turbo. It's not the fastest tank out there. When it comes to Tier 7 rammers, though, I would say it's an okay choice as long as you have it fully upgraded. That is one thing about the Magnate and the Season tanks, is there are a lot of modules, and the starting modules are very different than the final modules in these past tanks. But if you have this tank, it's an okay tank. I would say it's probably one of the better ones to use in Tier 7, but not the best. And moving on, we will move into another class of tanks that surprisingly have this ability. And for that, we have the Tier 7 German tank destroyer, the E25. Some people also like to call it the Cockroach, which, I mean, yeah, I kind of get it. E25 is kind of a weird little gremlin tank. It's pretty speedy, has a ridiculously fast-firing gun. Doesn't have great alpha, though. It's a 75mm, so you're still going to be putting out close to what, like, the Tier 6 mediums put out. But when it comes to Mad Games, this is kind of a weird choice for having ramming abilities, and that's because the weight of the E25 is not that great. It is only 25.96 tons. Though it does have a class-leading power-to-weight ratio of 26.97 horsepower per ton. That is actually the best horsepower per ton of all the tanks. This is the best power-to-weight ratio. This thing is very, very fast, but it is not very heavy. So even though you can get around the map and you can ram into tanks, you're not going to do as much ramming damage as, say, the Magnate, which is basically 10 tons heavier than you. This is actually the second lightest tank on this list, and just because of that, this isn't my go-to when it comes to ramming tanks. It's, again, another tank that I would probably only use if its birthday ×5 ×2 was available. And now we'll move on to the one researchable tank in Tier 7 that has a ramming ability that I know of right now in my list, and that is the T25/2. This is a US tank destroyer. Kind of think of it as a beefed up Hellcat or a beefed up Jackson. It is slower than the Hellcat, so I guess maybe kind of closer to like an up-tiered Jackson. It has a 90mm. It has a fairly good rate of fire. The reason why I really like this particular tank destroyer for ramming is it is class leading when it comes to weight in Tier 7. This is the heaviest rammer at 43.82 tons, though that does come at the cost of power to weight ratio. The power to weight ratio is a disappointing 16.66 horsepower per ton. So you are not going to be the fastest tank, but when it comes to ramming, when you do ram, you will do a fair bit of damage. Also, if people ram into you unsuspectingly, you can also do quite a bit of damage to them. So of the three, I would probably say the T25 would win out just because it's researchable. But if you have all three of these tanks, I would probably go with the Magnate first, T25 second, and E25 third. And now we can move into Tier 8. Tier 8 has 7 tanks, 4 of which are Tech Tree researchable vehicles. And we will start with a Tech Tree researchable vehicle, and that is the TVP VTU Concept, which is a Czech medium tank at Tier 8. It's kind of a weird tank. It gives me Panther vibes, but it has a fairly large gun. It has a 105mm gun. It just looks kind of like a Panther or a Panther 2 if like you just kind of made it more boxy, I guess. This one's definitely kind of an all-rounder when it comes to ramming for Mad Games. The TVP comes in at 36.11 tons and has a power-to-weight ratio of 19.39 horsepower per ton. Neither of these are bad. These are very good, middle-of-the-road, all-arounder sort of weight and power to weight when it comes to ramming. So you should be able to get, you know, decent amount of damage if you were to ram someone. The only drawback is that 105mm gun, because you obviously still shoot tanks in Mad Games. It's got a fairly lengthy reload, but it's still an okay tank. I still use the TVP from time to time in Mad Games. And coming up next is another Czech medium tank. This is the premium Škoda T27. Which is an autoloader, has a 3-shell autoloader clip, and can dump shells every 1.5 seconds when it comes to dumping that clip. I do like the fact that you can get your rounds out pretty quick, especially if you're in like a close quarters situation, or if you just want to pull out, unload your clips, and then pull back. It's very useful. Reload time is somewhere in the 14s or 15 seconds, so like you do have to wait around for the clip. But I will say this is probably one of the better rammer tanks. Its weight is 39.66 tons, so almost 40 tons. And its power to weight ratio is an impressive 20.17 horsepower per ton. So it's fairly speedy, fairly heavy, not the heaviest. But when it comes to Tier 8, it is one of the speediest, but not the speediest tanks in the power to weight ratio department. And then another nice thing about the T27, even though it is a premium, it does come into the shop fairly often. As a matter of fact, lately it's been coming in with its special camo here, which is called Rampant. This has been offered with the tank in the premium shop the last few times that I have seen it. This is a fairly easy premium to get, in my opinion. If you're going to use it for Mad Games, it's more than adequate. Definitely above average when it comes to its weight and power to weight ratio. And now moving on, we will go to the Swedish Tier 8 medium, the Lansen C. And the Lansen's another kind of like tank that's like the TVP, got a big gun, fairly decent alpha, but slightly longer reload. Also doesn't have that much armor, so you'll get shot up pretty easily. When it comes to Mad Games, it's kind of strange. It is the lightest tank in my list at 23.63 tons, and you'd think maybe it's fast, but its power to weight ratio is incredibly average at 19.47 horsepower per ton. So it's not fast, even though it's light. Like, you know, at least with like, say, like the E25 in Tier 7, you're light, but you're really fast. You are the fastest tank in my list. Here, we're not breaking, like, I mean, we're slightly above average, maybe, or at best average. I mean, you're in the same ballpark as maybe the Wi-Fi Firefly when it comes to horsepower per ton. I mean, at least, but the problem is that the Wi-Fi Firefly is also heavier than the Lansen C and is 2 tiers below it. So I can't really recommend the Lansen C as a tank that you should use for Mad Games. I don't know how often this collector tank comes out on the shop. I've seen it once or twice. I got it in a crate, you know, that's cool, but I don't use this tank all that often for Mad Games. Again, it's one of those situations where if it was its birthday or something like that, sure, cool, I would use it, just kind of grind that out and then shelve it for the time being. And now moving on to probably the most popular, or at least in my opinion, the most widely used Tier 8 medium tank for ramming in Mad Games. That is the German Tier 8 medium Panther II. And oh boy, the Panther II gets used a lot. And why is that? Well, I'm going to go straight to the stats on this one. The Panther II comes in at a massive 53.5 tons, but that comes at the cost of mobility. The power to weight ratio is the most disappointing in this list at a 15.89 horsepower per ton. It is by far the weakest power to weight ratio on this list, but when you have such a massive weight at almost 54 tons, the trade-off may be worth it. The other thing to think about when it comes to the Panther II is, as I mentioned earlier, when some tanks use the accelerator as a last-ditch effort to ram, if somebody were to do that to the Panther II, they would most certainly come out the loser in that confrontation. The Panther II being so heavy and adding the ramming ability to it would instantly knock the enemy tank out, even though the enemy tank is ramming the Panther II and not the other way around. The Panther II would definitely be the winner when it came to that confrontation. So I will say, I don't consider the Panther II to be the best tank in Tier 8 to use because of its mobility, but it is definitely one of the better tanks to use in Tier 8 due to its weight. And now we'll move to the next Tier 8 medium tank, and that is a German collector called the Kampfpanzer 07RH. Now, the Kampfpanzer is kind of an interesting looking tank. If we zoom in really quick, you can see there's a little cutout at the bottom here where the barrel goes, and that's because this front plate of the turret actually is stationary, and the turret's kind of like oscillating behind it. So some people call this tank a down-tiered Leopard 1, and that's because it's got fairly good rate of fire and fairly good alpha. It's also got fairly good mobility. But when it comes to Mad Games, it's okay. The Kampfpanzer comes in at a weight of 35.1 tons, but it has a fairly impressive power to weight ratio of 20.51 horsepower per ton. So while you're not the heaviest tank out there, when it comes to Tier 8, you are certainly the fastest. It's kind of hard to recommend this tank though. I don't see a lot of Kampfpanzers on the field. I think that's because it's only been offered a handful of times outside of its crates, and I think the price is probably a little high. I think I got the Kampfpanzer in the shop right before the 10th anniversary of the game. They had a lot of specials, and the Kampfpanzer was one of them. It's a cool looking tank, I'll give it that, but there are definitely better tanks in Tier 8 to use for Mad Games ramming. And we can move on to our next Tier 8 tank, and that is the Indian Panzer, which I said earlier may or may not show up in the list, and it does. And right away you can see the similarities between the Magnate and the Indian Panzer. Now, the Indian Panzer, being a tier up from the Magnate, is slightly better in some respects. It is heavier at 39.15 tons and also has a slightly better power to weight ratio at 19.67 horsepower per ton. So it is a little bit quicker than the Magnate, and it's also a little bit heavier. It's about the same. It does have slightly better reload than the Magnate as well, since it's a tier up. But this is another okay all-rounder. It's kind of like the TVP. It's okay if you have it. It's an okay, acceptable tank to use in Mad Games if you're trying to ram other tanks. And we have now made it to the last tank on the list, and that is the US Tier 8 medium tank, the M26 Pershing. I owned the M26 before I got the Panther II, but I never used the M26 in Mad Games for ramming until recently. When I looked up the stats for the M26, I would consider the M26 the best all-arounder, and let me explain why. So, the weight of the M26 is 42.57 tons. Granted, you are 10 tons lighter than the Panther II. Your mobility is much better, in my opinion, at 18.09 horsepower per ton when it comes to power to weight ratio. Yes, you are lighter, but you are much more mobile. And that being said, this seems a little bit more balanced than the Panther II. I would probably, and this is probably a controversial opinion, I would probably consider the M26 Pershing to be best in class when it comes to Tier 8 Mad Game rammers, because even though you're not as heavy as the Panther II, you're far more mobile because you have better power to weight ratio. It's just my opinion, I'd probably go with the M26 over the Panther II, and I do play the M26 more than I do the Panther II when it comes to Tier 8 Mad Games if I'm looking to ram people. So we are at the end of Tier 8. I can show you really quick. Tier 9 has nothing, so we will move to the one and only tank that I have in Tier 10 that is usable for Mad Games and ramming, and that is the French AMX 30B. Now, the French AMX 30B is kind of a weird tank. The thing is that this tank is not very heavy. This tank comes in at a weight of 34.58 tons, but it has a incredible power to weight ratio of 20.82 horsepower per ton. So while you are not the heaviest Tier 10 medium, as a matter of fact, things like the E50M is twice as heavy as you. You do have a very, very good mobility at that power to weight ratio. That being said, I don't play a lot of Tier 10 to start with, but B, I don't know, if I'm going to play Tier 10, I'll probably look at, honestly, I play my Sheridan Missile more than I play my AMX 30B. Sheridan Missile obviously is not a rammer, so I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot, but just, I don't know, the AMX 30B being so light, yeah, you're fast, but you don't do a whole lot of damage, and there are much, much heavier tanks in Tier 10 than you. I don't know, it's not my favorite. I don't use it that much. But that is my 15 tanks that I have for Mad Games when it comes to using the ramming ability. As I said earlier, I will put up a list that shows the complete effective horsepower to a ton, the weight power to weight ratios here. I'll go ahead and I'll put that up right now, so you can take a look at it. Some tanks, the power to weight ratio is slightly worse than advertised when it comes to effective, and some are much better. For the most part, they are pretty similar. But yeah, those are the tanks I like to use for Mad Games when it comes to ramming. That's really all I do in Mad Games, is use these tanks. The only other tanks I tend to use are like the T-49 or the Sheridan Missile, and that's because they have ridiculously high alpha and they have the ability to regenerate health. And since they have such high alpha, they regenerate a fairly large amount of health per shot. Let me know if you have any of these tanks, or you know, if anyone has any opinions when it comes to what's a better rammer tank to use. And hey, if you didn't know that some of these tanks were rammers, now you know, to when you see them on the battlefield, hey, don't ram these tanks. Or if you have them in your garage, now you have another tank that you can put on your roster for the rammers. Anyways, that will be it for today. Thank you guys for watching, and until I see you in the next video, take it easy. Bye-bye.